As my colleague Rabbi Stern indicated this morning, our tale begins with celebration before quickly turning toward horror. Sarah's promised son Isaac is born and welcomed and weaned, but after his weaning, Sarah instructs Abraham to send away her maidservant Hagar and Hagar's son Ishmael, lest the boy lay claim to part of Isaac's inheritance. Abandoned in the wilderness by Abraham with nothing more than a loaf of bread and a skin of water, mother and son wander the open desert until their water runs out. Then Hagar sets Ishmael underneath a bush and crawls away before bursting into tears. Giving voice to her darkest fear, she cries out, Al ere b'mot hayaled. Don't make me watch my son die. In one day, Hagar's life had transformed from one of safety and security into one fraught with terror and peril. Yesterday, Hagar watched as her son, Abraham's eldest, played contentedly alongside his half-brother. Today, she's waiting for her son to die from starvation and thirst in the middle of the desert. And she is completely paralyzed. She can no longer think or plan or take action. Her only remaining choice from her fear-addled perspective is to watch her son die alone in the wilderness. But Hagar is not alone. God hears her cry, and God responds, telling her to pick up her son before promising to turn him into a great nation. And then, according to our text, God opens her eyes, and she sees a well of water. Just moments after lamenting the inescapable death of her son, Hagar looks and sees that there's water right there, just waiting for her. Her fear had completely obscured her vision, preventing her from seeing any choice available to her other than freezing with panic. Now, before we judge Hagar, we ought to remember that her behavior is totally natural. When faced with life-threatening circumstances, the human body shifts control away from our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that manages analytical skills like problem solving, organization, emotional regulation, critical thinking, decision making, useful stuff, and gives control to our midbrains, which possess three basic responses: fight, flight, or freeze. Now, we call this process fear. And fear is the human body's alarm system. It's one that's designed to safeguard us from potential predators and life-threatening perils, one that enabled us to navigate the countless dangers of the natural world. So when we encounter a predator, it's prudent to act quickly, to either fight back or run away, or simply play dead, fight, flight, freeze. And so our brains remove any other choices from our field of vision. They do that to keep us alive. But fear is designed to protect us from immediate threats that require instantaneous instinctual responses. When something else triggers our sense of fear of failure, fear of the unknown, fear of loneliness or rejection, even fear of losing a loved one, then our fears can quickly prove detrimental. By restricting our brains to those three limited choices, our fears effectively silence our analytical minds, often when we need them most. And so instead of rescuing us from danger, like it's intended to do, fear can instead place us further in harm's way. This is precisely what happens to Hagar. Overwhelmed by her fear for her son, she freezes, blind to any other options available. She can't understand that there's water just a few steps away. She's paralyzed by a fear that almost leads to catastrophe. Maybe that's why we've been taught from infancy to silence our fears. We prize calm under fire, the ability to respond dispassionately and maintain our cool regardless of circumstances, because we believe that our analytical minds can get us out of any predicament. And we equate fear with weakness because we know that absent our analytical minds, we can easily head straight toward disaster, just like Hagar. Fear, as author Frank Herbert suggests, is the mind killer. And so we hide our fears, concealing them behind a facade of indifference or clothing them in the increasingly fashionable raiment of anger or resentment or indignation. Sometimes we even shun the fears of others, attempting to distance ourselves from any instance of fright. But our attempts to recast or to spurn our fears cannot help us. In fact, they only lead to greater harm. The Buddhist tradition describes fear as a kind of knife, twisting and turning inside us. When we attempt to ignore or bury our fears, the blade continues to twist, sabotaging our souls in countless ways. And when we wrap our fears in anger and indignation, we delude ourselves into thinking we can halt the damage inside us by attacking someone else. The truth is, we cannot address our fears by trying to reject them. And so we would be mistaken to criticize or reproach Hagar for her paralyzing fear. After all, she doesn't choose to be afraid. She's a mother facing her deepest, darkest fear, the death of her son. Of course she's afraid. You don't have to be a parent to imagine how terrifying it must be to watch your child face death. We too should be frightened to our very core. And tragically, some of us here already know that terror all too well. Hagar is afraid because there's little else in life that is worth fearing more. But Hagar never hides her fears. She is brutally honest, which is ultimately what brings her salvation. In a different telling of this story, Hagar might not cry out at all. Instead, she might seethe with rage. After all, she and her son were only in danger because Sarah couldn't stand the thought of Isaac sharing his inheritance with Ishmael. Hagar may have faced death with defiance, cursing the evil Sarah and Abraham, who mercilessly abandoned her and her son to die in the wilderness. Or Hagar might act unconcerned, pushing away her fears to pretend that everything was just fine as she frantically wandered the same paths, unsuccessfully searching for a desert oasis. But Hagar does neither. Instead, she acknowledges and holds her fear close, stripping away any pretense to anger or disinterest. Instead of pushing her fears away, instead of cloaking them in resentment and rage, Hagar identifies her fears and gives voice to them, sharing them with the only one around to listen. Yes, Hagar is afraid, very afraid. But in crying out, she's not giving in to her fears. She's just acknowledging them, and she's sharing them, which is what allows her to finally see. As the Buddhists teach, only once we have identified the knife of fear inside us, may we vigilantly keep the blade at rest. And should the dagger once again escape our sight, only those who know about it can help us. This is the enduring lesson of Hagar's torment. Not that we must find a way to push away our fears, but that by acknowledging them and sharing them, we can hold on to our fears and choose how to move forward with them at our side. Young children often take these steps instinctively, attempting to name and share their fears with a trusted adult. Now, for parents, this can prove mystifying, as our children's sudden and sometimes incomprehensible fears seem to appear out of nowhere, just in time to thwart dinner time or bedtime routines. I cannot count the hours I've spent explaining to my toddler that wolves will not invade her bedroom at night. But if I take the time to let her name and discuss her fears with me, in the end, she always goes to sleep. She lives with whatever real fears lie beneath her preoccupation with wolves. And she does so by naming her fears and sharing them. We enacted these steps just minutes ago when we recited today's most harrowing prayer, the Unatana Tokef. We enumerated and shared our deepest and darkest terrors. Who shall live and who shall die? Who by fire and who by water? Who by sword and who by beast? Who by hunger and who by thirst? Who by earthquake and who by plague? Who by strangling and who by stoning? Who shall be troubled? Who shall be poor? Who shall be humbled? Together we acknowledged and gave voice to these, our greatest fears, sharing them with our Creator and with our community. And then we affirmed all together that as long as we have breath in our lungs, we still have the power to choose. Uteshuva, utefila, utstaka, ma'avirin et roa hagazera. But repentance, prayer, and charity dampen the malice of judgment's decree. We can live alongside our fears, our fear of mortality, our fear of tragedy, our fear of impoverishment, even our fears for our children, when we remember the choices we do have. We cannot choose what will happen to us in the year to come, but we can choose who we will be in the year to come. Just 1 year ago, our lives transformed from lives of safety and security to lives fraught with mortal peril. On October 6th, the Jewish world rested, undaunted by the dangers lurking just beneath the surface in Israel and across the globe. By the next day, we had borne witness to unthinkable horrors. The carefully planned rape and murder of our fellow Jews. The comprehensive failure of the state of Israel to protect its own citizens. The casual dismissal of Jewish lives by cynical or willfully ignorant factions of the political and academic world. And a resurgence of anti-Semitic rhetoric across the globe. On October 6th, we watched Israeli families, teenagers, and children laugh and dance playfully in celebration of friendship and love. By the next day, we were waiting for them to die in the darkness. And we've been gripped by fear ever since. Fear for the lives of our brothers and sisters still held captive. Fear for the safety of loved ones venturing into the Gaza Strip or Lebanon as members of the IDF, or family members within the reach of Hamas or Hezbollah rockets. Fear for the well-being and dignity of Jewish students and faculty at college campuses across America. Fear for the very future of Israel and of Jewish communities throughout the globe, including our own. It's okay to be afraid. I'm afraid too. I'm afraid for the hostages. I'm afraid for the soldiers. I'm afraid for the families, Jewish and Arab alike, living under the constant threat of violence. And I'm afraid for my daughters and the world they will inherit. I'm afraid that the day may come when it won't be safe for them to visit our people's ancient home. I'm afraid the day may come when they may not be welcome to visit our people's ancient home. I'm afraid the day may come when it may not be safe for them to be Jews in America. I'm afraid the day may come when it may not be safe for them to be women in America. Fear upon fear, blade upon blade, we have been caught in a tapestry of terror. But like Hagar, we cannot move forward until we acknowledge our fears and hold them close, until we strip away any pretense to anger or disinterest, until we bare our souls to God and to the world, remembering that though we cannot choose what will happen to us, we can choose how to live alongside our fears, not despite them. Then, God willing, we'll discover that the well was sitting right there all along, just waiting for us to find it. Shana Tova.